Hello, my name is Megs Reynolds, and I'm the Executive Director for the Dumar Agriculture Foundation. We are the national voice and champion for mental health in Canadian agriculture, and this is part of our Talk It Out series. This month, we're focusing on grief and loss. Joining me today is Tracy Young. Tracy, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand it over to you so that you can further introduce yourself to everyone and let us know your background.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. I'm excited to be a part of this. So a little bit about me and where I'm coming from. I was born and raised in rural Manitoba. I now live in the big city of Brandon, in Manitoba as well, with my family and my two girls. I grew up surrounded and immersed in the egg industry, and both my parents were egg dealers. Most of my memories growing up are playing out in the fields, in the barns, quadding around with my friends, climbing the bale stacks, those sorts of things. So even though I'm a city girl now, my heart is still in rural parts of our country and of Manitoba. And I went into the mental health field 20 plus years ago and have spent the last couple of decades focused on trying to improve upon all aspects of rural mental health. And I now, in varied roles, I guess, there's varied roles that I've held in mental health and around education, mental health promotion, agriculture counseling. I now am looking at rural mental health research and basing all of the work that I've done over time in grief. And that has sort of been the basis of my professional practice throughout my career.
Perfect person to be on having this conversation today. I think probably the best place for us to start is maybe trying to put a bit of a definition around what is grief and is it different from maybe some of the other words that get used like mourning or bereavement?
Okay. Yeah, for me, grief is very different in itself and how any one person might describe it or define it or what it means to them. And that's very much what I encourage people to do is to find their own understanding and their own meaning of it. Grief for me, it's big, it's broad, it's vast, it's deep, and it's changing all the time, depending on the experience you have with it and how you live with it. For me, it's an evolving way that we manage everything in our lives. And that's the reason that I've based my career on how it molds us and how it maneuvers through our lives. Some of those other words you mentioned, mourning, bereavement, those to me are specific words. Those are more centered around things like loss. Whereas grief, although we often put it together with things such as loss, and death, it to me also means a lot of other things and can be really described very differently from one person to the next.
That is a great definition. I think that's the first time I've heard it defined that way. And you're right, we like to, I think, kind of just attach it to loss, especially loss of someone that was in our life. And we don't often see that it could be part of changes in life or that it can come from different experiences and not just losing that family member or that friend.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important word to put towards loss, and the English language gives us all kinds of words that put meaning to that and that we find some way to kind of describe it. But in all the work that I do and how I've based my practice, it's really that grief is what it means to the individual experiencing it. And whatever emotions need to go in there and be attached to it, those are the ones I want to work with and try to help to support.
So with looking at grief that way and how it can be different from everyone and the different emotions that can attach, you know, I feel like traditionally we've said like we've defined grief as one thing and there are different phases you go through, different emotions you have. So does that then change how we think of kind of what could be that's defined or classified as those common stages of grief?
Yeah, I think the language of grief is very much about those stages that you've heard of over the years and how people um, have defined them over time, and they're still important words to put towards grief and how some people might explain them. I think some people maybe move through those kind of phases or a version of them in a reasonable way. Sometimes people jump from one to the other, and that there may not be that solid pattern that we sometimes see when they're explained to us. Sometimes I think some of them hit us hard and like a slap in the face. And other times we might go through a phase, not even really being aware of the fact that we're going through it and that our emotions have changed. So you hear about people talking like the whole shock and denial, pain and guilt, the anger stage, and bargaining towards bettering those emotions. Sort of that upswing and finding change and a turn in how those emotions are sitting and reconstructing the self and working through some things to a point of acceptance and hope. Those are some of the words I know kind of traditionally go with grief and the stages of it. And certainly all words that I like to explore and learn more about from people. But I don't think there's any solid rule book as to how someone needs to go through them, or that they have to hit each of those to be processing properly. I feel like there's lots of flexibility because grief is so broad and so big.
I think that's important that you don't necessarily have to hit on each one of them because I think we've been, I don't know if taught is the right word to use, but led to believe that we need to, and that there is a very defined process of how we're meant to move through grief and loss.
And that can make grief a lot trickier for people to understand and to comprehend and to change with, right? If we're expecting ourselves to kind of hit this marker or be at a certain stage, or we think we're falling behind where other people's expectations are, it makes it much more challenging and harder on people. So I like to put that notion out there, right? That it doesn't have to be this A, B, C, D, E kind of process, right? That people can do it as they need to, take as much time with whatever phase they're in that they require, and that how they shape each step that they take is really up to them, and that they're in control of that.
Yeah, one of the interviews we did as part of our topic this month was with one of our ambassadors, Chris, and he talked about, the loss of his wife and grief and how oftentimes he'll go back to a certain emotion or stage. And that's, been something that's been constant for him, that it hasn't just been, like you say, that linear process, but sometimes going back to that one stage of having anger around what happened or what have you. And I think that's a good thing to realize, because we can be hard on ourselves when we're not progressing a way that we think we're supposed to be progressing. And in reflection for our conversation today, I was noticing that this time of year I have more sadness in my day to day, and it's linked to when I moved off farm. And so for me, there is grief there. And even though that was 4 years ago, but that is still something that, and I don't think I've recognized it before as almost kind of that seasonal feeling that comes up.
Mhm.
But just interesting how that can kind of play into whether it's something that, triggers it from that goes on in our life or a time of our life or what have you, but understanding that that is possibly a process that will continue, maybe not for your entire life, but for a chunk of time as you process things and work through things.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Pieces of grief that you thought were in the past can come up again at any point in time. And that relates to that whole idea, right? That it's not this linear process, and that you're not done it when you get to this certain part, right? And it's not over necessarily. You maybe feel like you've gotten to a good spot
Mm.
and you're living well with it. And that's great. But it isn't to say that you're backsliding because something comes up, right? It's just something has triggered that, and it's living with you differently, right? I don't think it's something we need to get rid of. That's the other thing I feel
Right.
like is important in grief, right? It doesn't need to go away. There's parts of it that we want to see go away and that we don't want to hold close to us, but um, it's important that we understand how to live with it and we adjust to that over time, and that we keep the pieces of it that are important and special with us forever, and we don't tackle those things away, right? If it's associated with a loss. I don't want all of it to vanish and
Mm.
disappear. I want to hang on to the bright spots and learn how I fit that into my life as I move forward.
Yeah, I like that. And sometimes it's just acknowledging that there is that emotion there, right? That
Hmm.
that can be just enough that, oh, this is how I'm feeling, and I understand why I'm feeling that way, and that's okay. And
Hmm.
able to just kind of continue on. One of the questions that did come up kind of prior to our conversation was, there can be different names, I think, for grief or for different types of grief. Um, with how you've talked about grief so far, is that something we should, like, I have words in front of me and I don't even know if I should use them. Like, should we just stay away from that and have it really just focused on like what the individual or what I'm feeling in that time and just kind of go with where we're at?
I think putting those labels out there is fine, right? I mean, sometimes people want to find a label that fits for them. So finding and hearing about all those other types of grief that we've identified and tried to kind of categorize, it's valuable to people to learn about them, right? There's so many I can think of, and they all have a different explanation, and that goes with my whole idea of wanting to define grief for yourself, right? And finding your own title for it. And maybe it isn't even grief that you call it, maybe it's something else. But right, you hear of absent grief, anticipatory
Yeah.
grief, complicated grief, delayed grief, traumatic grief. Like there's so many different labels we can put with it. I think it's just really key and important to remember that grief is full of all kinds of emotions, all kinds of words, and we try to put words to things to explain them so that we can find our way through them. When we have words to describe them, then it helps us to take steps with them and to find different ways to pocket them into our lives. Um, and I feel like there's no emotion that's bad. I wish that the English language didn't say, like, here's the list of negative emotions and here's the list of positive ones, right? But they're just all emotions. And each one that we have helps us to the next one, right? Each one feeds into another one and helps us process those things and learn from them and use them to our advantage. So, yeah, I think the types of grief that are out there that many talk about are important because people need labels and words to put to things so that they can understand them better and see how they fit in their lives. But I think we can add to the list and contribute to that in any way we feel is important. And it doesn't have to just stick to the dictionary definitions that are out there or things we find in textbooks.
I think that's important. Um, what with grief and feeling grief, I know that, one of the things that I like to talk about at kind of a higher level is how what is going on with us mentally can affect our physical. So are there kind of more of those physical traits or characteristics that may happen when you are experiencing grief? Um, or are there, if you're have grief and you're experiencing grief, but you're not, you're trying to just shove it into a box and put it somewhere, are you more likely to possibly see some of those physical signs then coming out because you're not processing that emotion that is there?
Yeah, that's another interesting part about grief, right? It affects us in so many different ways. So I feel like there's the thinking parts of it, there's the physical parts of it, and then there's the emotional parts of it. And they're all important to kind of understand within ourselves. And you're right, if we kind of box some of them up and set them aside, and we're not trying to work at managing some of those boxes, then they're going to become a struggle, most likely. So I try to encourage people when I'm giving support around grief or around this kind of whole concept of life and the management of it, um, that we need to look at what all those separately. So we look at how we're thinking about the words and the feelings and what those emotions are doing to our thought processes. I feel like we need to spend time talking about the emotions themselves and what they mean to us and labeling them and understanding them. And I feel like we also need to identify what we're doing or how we're feeling those things physically. Do you have physical pain, physical exhaustion? How is your sleep, right? How are you managing your nutrition? And that's the whole life balance, right? That's all the pieces that go into grief, which is, again, this life process, the way I see it. And we need to balance all those things, whether grief is there and it's identified or it's not, and make sure that we're kind of keeping all those things in check so that we can be the best version of ourselves, living with some of the things that are the most devastating.
Yeah, and that came up in our interviews as well as a way to possibly check in on people that we know went through something, and that might be experiencing grief, but to say, hey, like, did you sleep last night, or how did you sleep last night? Have you
Yeah.
eaten anything today? Because sometimes we, don't want to answer how we're doing, or we might shy away from that. But that, checking in on those life pieces, like you said, can be a way to maybe even have that person hit pause and say, oh, maybe there is something going on that I haven't identified or that I'm not dealing with right now, but is affecting kind of the life side and my day to day.
Yeah, I find physical pain and exhaustion are the two that aren't recognized as associated with grief the most often, right? I'll have a conversation with someone and ask those kind of more random questions that they don't feel like maybe fit the conversation. And they're like, oh, right. Like, yeah, the pain in my legs, that's because of everything else I'm dealing with, or the pain in my back, right? Like it's something specific that they can suddenly associate with all the things that they're feeling. And it's puzzling sometimes, but also very profound, right? When people figure that out, that there's like, wow, if I like deal and manage with some of these very specific things that I've been avoiding, other aspects of my life will feel a lot better too.
Hmm. Yeah, I think especially on the physical pain side, that can be a big one. Not knowing or understanding that that connection is there, but then possibly that being a barrier remover for working on some of the emotional side that someone may want to stay away from. But understanding that, oh, if this is going to take that physical pain away, then maybe I can do this. Maybe this is more approachable.
Yeah. Um, and the whole exhaustion thing, right? Like understanding that emotions they take energy and they eat up so much of your time. Also, I find the understanding around like um, when people are having trouble making decisions or taking a next step or remembering things, their memory is all of a sudden foggy, and like they used to rely on that a lot. When they can associate that with their feelings of grief and the management of that in their life, then they realize they don't need to be so hard on themselves, and they're not like falling apart. They're just putting all their energy into managing the biggest piece right now. And it's okay. They're going to come back to some of those skills and know them the way that they used to. Um, giving them rationale, right, for why there's these other struggles going on. That's a big deal.
Yeah, that understanding piece, right? Taking away that
Mhm.
that unknown. With this being such a broad thing and being so unique to kind of where everyone's at and what they're going through, what would be your maybe go-to or top uh, coping mechanisms or strategies for someone to bring into their day-to-day?
Um, I typically like to start small. It may not feel small when I ask the questions because people don't want to put words to what they're finding, but that's where I start. It's just tell me what this is for you. Tell me what grief is, right, in this situation. Let's put some words to this and try to understand it in a way that makes sense to you so that you know what it is you're living with and what you're trying to manage. And then from there, setting small steps, small goals, right? Not big, huge ones that, okay, like by the end of the next 2 months, I'm going to forget about all of this and it's going to all be gone and I'm going to be all better, right? It's not about that. It's about learning to live with something that you didn't anticipate, or with a big loss and hardship, right? The biggest risk in love and relationships is loss. And we also can't live without love and relationships, and care and nurturing, right, from people around us. So um, we take the biggest risks, and in that, the consequences are going to be that we suffer those losses, but that it's okay to keep making those decisions, keep reaching out. That's the other thing I guess I would encourage, that as I use a main strategy, right? Who are your supports? Who are your people? Um, and it doesn't have to be a long list. It can be small, or maybe it's something that you have at home, something that you have close to you. And it's that thing that you can really trust and embrace. Um, the other strategy that I really focus on with people is trying to turn what we see as a long list of negative emotions that surround grief into positives. So, where can you find inside of grief the joy and the love. And there is where you want to exist, right? That is where you want to hold on to it. And that's where you want to process this stuff and realize that grief isn't all bad and all negative, and it isn't something that you can't do.
Yeah, those are great. And I think that's important to remember that we don't have that grief or that loss without the positives and the love that came first, right? Like there was a
Yeah.
connection led to now how we're feeling. And so how do we focus on that or bring those pieces into how we process and move on? Um, try to do that with my girls with when they get into kind of that negative headspace. It's like, okay, what could we be saying right now that is positive instead of that negative, I can't, I can't, I can't.
Yeah. Yeah, because we can, even when it's the hardest, right? Even when it's the biggest, baddest looking thing, there's something inside of that that is so meaningful that we can turn around into a positive and into a good thing. And that's what's going to keep us trucking forward and seeing into the next chapter.
And I like your comment about little steps too, because I think we often we will set the bigger goals or we will put, tighter timelines or more expectations on ourselves. And sometimes the reality is if we need to break it down by the hour or by the 5 minute mark or by the minute, that's okay. That's our way of being able to get to the next spot and to the next spot. And in doing that, we're still moving forward.
Yes, and that you really have to set your timeline. That sure, there's things in life that are going to kind of predict or dictate a bit about how quickly you might need to move, but ultimately it can be as slow or as fast as you need it to be. And it's hard to separate yourself sometimes from the outside expectations and the assumptions as to where you're at or how you must be feeling or any of those things when it comes to the traditional types of grief and loss or associated with loss. But it has to be on your own timeline, or it's not going to work.
This wasn't on the list, but I'd love to touch on boundaries too, because I feel boundaries are so important and we don't always think about how we adjust them for what is going on or where we're at and how beneficial sometimes those boundaries can be when you are going through a lot. So if you are in that space where you're having to, break things down where it's like, how do I get through the next 5 minutes? Sometimes being able to change your boundaries to help, protect you because your capacity for everything else is smaller is so important to be aware that that is something you can do.
Yeah, and that it's okay to say no, right? These reminders are important when you're processing through and managing grief as well, that you can set those parameters, right? You set your timeline, you set your parameters. If you need to say no, if you need more time away from whatever is traditional or routine in your life, that's okay too. And you have the right to ask for those things as they fit, right? You just like any other complicated situation in life, you have to kind of set your bounds and set what's comfortable to be able to get to a place where you feel like you're at your best. Everyone's always trying to aspire, right, to be the best version of themselves, right? I feel like that's what we're aiming for, right? To do better and to give more and to get to a better spot in life. But we have to do that in a calculated way. And I don't mean badly, right? But in a calculated, thoughtful, meaningful way. And we can't just race to the finish line and feel success at the end of that. So boundaries, yes, super important.
How do we tell either for ourselves or for someone that we're close enough to be able to kind of recognize some of those signs when or where the line is between being able to go through and work through our grief and our process and where we could benefit from having assistance of someone who is a professional? Like how do we know how would I know that's where, okay, I've hit this point, I should be reaching out to a professional or, someone in my life to say, hey, I'm worried about you. I think it's time to have that conversation.
Yeah, I think whether it's the individual themselves, much harder, I feel like, to identify for yourself when that boundary has been hit or when that wall has been hit, or to ask for that help. But if you're the person looking into a situation and trying to differentiate when you kind of cross the line and say, hey, like I can see that you're struggling more than you need to be right now, and let's get you some additional help. I feel like the boundary for me is when you see that person incurring more losses in their life, or there's more things that are hindered because of the process they're going through, right? So there's a reasonable amount of struggle that you can watch in somebody. But when that struggle is incurring not being able to go to work, not being able to get up out of bed, not being able to, in a semi-regular way, I should say, right? Because there's going to be days that you can't. But if it's to the point where someone is fully not able to do those things or has incurred an additional loss in their life, lost a job, lost another individual, lost another relationship, made a major change on top of a big loss or their process of grief. That's where I think it kind of crosses. I'm not sure if that's clear, that makes sense, but it's to me when there's additional problems being put on top of what was already there, that I would step in and say, hey, like, what about this? Or like, what do you think might be, do you think it's maybe time that we reach out to some other resources?
I think that's a great way to define it, because otherwise, I mean, you could see someone who's, maybe they're crying more often than you personally would cry, but that doesn't mean that they're not processing and dealing, and it's maybe not a negative, right? So I think that's a good way to look at that. It's more about, are they having other losses because of where they're at, and not, being able to process where they are and move more into, again, that like getting through life and the day-to-day in a positive, and not in a way that is, like you said, being taken away or having a negative effect on their day-to-day.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it stagnant, right? Or do you see some change? If you're still seeing change in a way that you feel like is helpful for them, then I think they're doing okay. Maybe they're not doing great, but they're doing
Mm.
okay. But if things are falling apart progressively or mounting on top of, yeah, that's for me when it becomes more critical.
We kind of touched on this with my share, but is there a point, if we just look at putting something in a box, I mean, I think we all know that there's a good chance that's going to come up later, or that's going to, manifest in different ways. What would be the best if someone's experiencing that, where, they put it all away and now they're at the point where they can't ignore it anymore? What's the best way for them to kind of go about maybe addressing that, or trying to open that box up and start to deal with something that they set aside years ago?
Um, I guess if it's something that they are kind of in charge of, right? If it's they're looking back on this box and thinking, okay, you know what, I need to go back there and I need to resolve some of what's in there and I'm ready. Then they're ready and they can go ahead and open it up. I feel like they need to be in a space where they have supports around them, right? That things are going well in life or generally okay. And that if opening that box is going to be traumatic and time consuming and exhausting, which likely is, who do they have to lean on? And are all those things in place? If something creeps up or that box is like spilled accidentally, then I suppose, right, it's the same things. It's, were they ready for that? Were they ready for that box to just like spontaneously erupt, or do we need to put other supports in place? So kind of two answers there. I guess it depends on how it comes up. And also in there, I want to say it's not necessarily bad that that person has boxed that up and that they're wanting to reopen it, or that it accidentally spills open, right? Sometimes that's what we have to do in order to be able to process and move forward, is kind of compartmentalize things and set things aside, knowing that we can come back later. And so we should never judge somebody for having done that in the first place, or be frustrated with them, right? That, okay, now here's all this stuff and you're dealing with it now, right? Like that often happens. So I think for the support person, it's really being cautious of that. And if this person is saying they want to deal with this now, making sure that they're journeying through that in a way that's smooth and that is supported and is admired versus being criticized.
What would you for, resources or books for people that are, going to be tuning into this later, recommendations you have for people either looking to learn more as that support person or maybe looking to, support themselves through what they're going through, or even just learn more in general. Like you said, we're always trying to be better versions of ourselves. So what would you recommend for people?
There's lots of options out there, and it depends on what fits for you. There's long lists of books that you can look into, whether they're like basic reading or more complicated kind of text reading to learn more about sort of how the brain works with some of these things. There's websites, there's podcasts, there's all kinds of groups, in person and virtual, that people could connect with if they want to talk to people who are in a like-minded space. The one that I often start with is a Canadian site, a website, and I just refer people to it to explore what all the options are out there. It's very well done. It's very well resourced. So Canadian Virtual Hospice and mygrief.ca. It has learning opportunities. It has connections to books and resources that are out there, modules that you can do for training. There's things for adults and kids and families and couples and spouses. Like, there's just so many different avenues you can explore. And from there, I find a lot of other people, if you start there, see what might be of interest to you, and then you can explore through your supports what maybe is more local or what is closer to home, if there's something that is a fit. So that's my biggest recommendation, is that site.
Yeah, that sounds great. There's everything there to at least start with, right? And explore
Mhm.
maybe what learning modality works best for you. And I love that there are things for children and families as well. That's
Yeah.
great. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you want to make sure that we talk about or we mention before we sign off?
Um, I don't know. I guess my underlying message, right, that grief is broad and big and vast and deep, and that we should always be open to other people's experiences of it and other people's understanding and their life experience with it. And as humans, we're judgmental. That's what we were born and raised to do. And we can do it in a soft way that lends support, and that we might learn from, right? Grief, every single process that I've gone through with someone surrounding that concept, I've learned something different, and it's continued to shape how I practice and how I live my own life. So there is so much good in it, even though we tend to see it as this big negative thing. So that would just be my kind of lasting comment that I would put out there.
That's a perfect way to wrap everything up. And thank you so much for giving all of us that perspective. I think having that and bringing that into our own lives is a gift. Thank you so much for sharing everything, for joining us. For those looking to learn more about mental health and agriculture, you can visit domore.ag. If you're looking to support to connect, sorry, I have a fly in my face. If you're looking to join our national peer-to-peer support platform that is free for anyone 16 years and older, available in English and French, fully anonymous and monitored 24/7 by mental health clinicians. You can find that at domore.ag/agtalk. Thank you everyone for sticking with us through another edition of Talk It Out.